As I speak to you, the cable ship Iris is approaching Southampton water after being 6 months away and travelling over 40,000 miles in the South Atlantic through the roaring 40s with danger from icebergs, from enemy aircraft and submarines. She had to navigate in these dangerous waters, maintaining radar silence, and she has returned home successfully. I want today to say a special thank you to the commander and crew of Iris who endured the monotony, the cold, the separation of a dangerous mission, and to their wives and families who had to endure the waiting, the uncertainty, and the news of the war situation in the South Atlantic. Iris's special performance, I think, was epitomized in the award of the British Empire Medal to her chief steward, Dick Barrett. Dick Barrett's services epitomized the caring of Iris for her passengers and all whom she served. I'm also delighted that her commander, Alan Fulton, was awarded the OBE. Alan earned his award personally by his seamanship and by his leadership, both of his crew and of those who travelled with them. But I think the award to him also is recognised by all as being recognition for the ship's company, for the tremendous services which they performed in the South Atlantic. Iris is a small ship, and she performed a vital role, transporting people, delivering mail, making pickups at sea, and entering shallow moorings with considerable danger. In the course of her duty, Iris developed a new meaning. CS Iris can supply in rain, ice, or storm.
The cable ship Iris, a 3,873-ton vessel owned and operated by British Telecom International, was the smallest of the many merchant ships requisitioned during those weeks in April 1982 when Argentina laid forcible claim to the Falklands and South Georgia. Now she was returning to an exuberant welcome at her home port of Southampton, nearly 6 months after the Argentinian surrender. The first to greet them, like the birds that warn of approaching land, were the helicopters loaded with journalists and television crews. Iris is one of 3 ships designed to maintain the network of submarine cables linking Britain with Europe and the rest of the world. Now she was sailing back to a reception unlike that laid on for any other cable ship. All the crew had unforgettable memories of the months that had followed the initial call to war.
I have an entry here for the 24th of April, 1982, at berth 203 West Southampton. The time was 20:45, and it says ship was requisitioned for service in connection with the Falklands Islands emergency. And this was the time when the ship was actually chartered by the Ministry of Defence to go down to the South Atlantic.
Once we'd overcome the original shock, we were all very much foregoing, and that included the whole crew. There was no exceptions as far as volunteers were concerned.
Because, you know, it's a ship I work on, and, you know, they said volunteers, and all the crew volunteered. You know, everyone volunteered.
I wanted to go straight away. And we were asked about 4 times during the day, you know, kept telling us bad things that might happen. Might not touch land for 6 months. And I just wanted to go.
In only 5 days in April 1982, the Iris was transformed into a vessel capable of a job for which she had never been designed, a military role in a fighting war.
Obviously, we were all rather apprehensive. The furthest this ship had ever been previously was as far as Vigo. It's an awful long way down to the Falklands, and although the machinery has been very, very good in the past, it seemed an extremely severe test under what was going to be bad conditions.
My reaction to the fact of going to war was, well, it's got to be done. It's another job which has got to be done, and I'm sure that this ship could do it to, you know, the best of our ability. We were very fortunate in the naval party that we had on board. professionals. The man who was in charge of the naval party, and he was my military advisor, Lieutenant Commander Biffle, his sheer professionalism and dogged determination to get the job done was an inspiration to me.
During Iris's refit at Devonport, the island of South Georgia was recaptured. It still seemed possible that Iris would not arrive in time to see any action in the South Atlantic. However, during the months that followed her departure, Iris and her crew were to see much of South Georgia as well as the Falklands. With the help of those who sailed on the Iris, we can reconstruct and recollect the highlights of this remarkable journey.
I was the medical officer attached with Naval Party 1870 because the Ministry of Defence felt that every ship ought to have a doctor on it, and so I was it. But I was slightly amused to discover I was going away on a ship called Iris. That touched my sense of humour. Just going to war on a ship called Iris, it doesn't sound right somehow.
The name Iris may not sound warlike, but she proved herself a tough ship in difficult conditions. Problems began soon after leaving the shores of Britain.
When we left, we had to carry navigation fuel for the helicopters, and so they gave us a great big rubber bag, almost what it was, and they made a tank around this hatch we're standing on now, and in the tank they had the chopper fuel in the tank, but the only trouble was with it, it kept moving too much. So in the middle of the night I was getting up at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, the captain, the old man was up and all, because it was so dangerous, all the stuff, and plus there was no smoking on decks all through the ship who was carrying us, and plus you had to be careful. You couldn't wear all rubber shoes and anything like that. You had nothing metal in your pockets. You had to make sure, and plus it was leaking over the deck, so all portholes had to be closed all the time, and it was quite a bad thing, really.
Then they all received some very sobering news. It was now clear to all that the Iris would not be turning back once the Ascension Islands were reached. First came the equator and the ceremony of crossing the line.
We volunteered the captain to go into stocks, and £1 per egg for people to throw them. We ran out of eggs, actually, and very good. We had a vicar who dressed up with a swear box at 10p a swear and made £140 in about an hour.
12 days after leaving Devonport, Iris reached Ascension Island. Now the real work started of provisioning and loading the vessel for the long journey through the South Atlantic.
Our first air attack actually happened in Ascension Island and was by an RAF Chinook helicopter. He was attempting to lower a snowcat tracked vehicle which we were tasked to take down to South Georgia. And it was getting dark. We'd been pushing to get all the stores on board so we could get south.
Unfortunately, the sheer downdraft and the noise from the helicopter set the whole bridge into motion, and we had a very frightening experience up there. The whole bridge turned to a big jelly, according to the pilot of the helicopter.
And unfortunately, his after rotor came too close to our radar scanner, our 10-centimetre radar scanner, and knocked it over the side. Fortunately, his after rotor wasn't damaged.
All of our crew were standing under it trying to land this snowcat, and had he come down, of course, there would have been a very nasty accident.
During the loading, the Iris lay offshore in the blue waters of Ascension. It was a view that First Officer John Newbury was to see from another angle.
Yes, that's right. When we first arrived down there, we were rather frustrated by not knowing what all the stores were that were coming aboard, and I asked the senior naval officer if I could get ashore in Ascension Island to see what the stores were. And he duly told me that he'd fix a helicopter. The deck was completely cluttered with loads that had been coming in, and I had to be winched up into the helicopter. I put the strop around myself, hanging on for grim death. Nobody had told me not to hold my hands up. I had, instead of holding my hands down. And I expected just to be winched up into the helicopter. Unfortunately, the senior naval officer had got to the pilot of the helicopter before I did, and the helicopter took off with me dangling under the helicopter. I don't know how high he went, but it seemed like several thousand feet before I finally was pulled into the cab. It was was a very frightening experience, and the Iris looked very, very tiny from my position dangling underneath the helicopter.
When Iris left Ascension, she was heavily laden and carrying more than her usual complement of crew. This put a severe strain on the catering staff.
Well, this is the crew mess, you know. I like to think of it as a restaurant, but it's the mess room, crew mess room, you know. A normal cable day, like when you have the normal crowd, is about 25, 28 maybe, you know, but because of we were carrying extra men, that was with the Navy personnel and our lads and the Marines, you know, which possibly came to about 60 people, you know.
If the assorted crew were short on space, they were at least able to get a decent haircut.
Yeah, I used to be a hairdresser before I joined British Telecom, so I've just sort of kept it up on here. I've done quite a lot of haircuts, about, I would imagine, about 300 or 400 haircuts. You know, what with the troops we were carrying, and we're on crew as well, and people that come from Ascension Island that came on board. I wasn't charging people, but they had to put something towards the charity. You know, we were getting a guide dog for the blind, so I asked them to put either 50 pence or a pound into the charity, so that boosted that up a bit.
As the Iris sailed on southwards, emergency drills became a regular feature of every day and night.
We have an emergency station where you go there, you know, like in case if the ship was hit, like you have certain duties to do, you know. I was in the first aid party, so we're designated to go to a certain position.
The weather, meanwhile, was getting colder.
You never know what the cold is until you hit the cold. If it was cold, then you had the gear to put on for the cold. No. When we come into the sunshine, the Ascensions, we struck off.
On May the 22nd, the crew of Iris heard that British troops had established a bridgehead at San Carlos. On the same day, HMS Ardent was sunk, and 9 Argentine aircraft were shot down. The threat from the air was becoming real. Soon, the crew of the Iris were to be putting their emergency drill to good use.
Well, I think the worst moment must have been the air raids. A totally unique experience, I think.
It's surreal, then you really move, you know what I mean? And that was the thing I always think about in my mind all the time. Even when I hear the bells go now, I still think about when that bell goes, you run, and that was it. Plus, I was in a funny old place where I was in an emergency party, so I was down below. So most people was running up top, and I was going down below, getting my firefighting equipment on. So I didn't like that too much, but...
Well, this was another thing. I mean, if you were going to get hit at all, it was going to be below the waterline, or just above it, and we were working there. So it was frightening, so it was, at the time.
I just kicked off, just about got in the swing of things, when the emergency bells rang, and I've never seen the mess room clear so quickly.
When we heard that the alarms go, and we've been expecting it for ever since we arrived, and when it actually happened, I think the butterflies started. However, it all passed off very well, and fortunately the intruders disappeared from the radar screen after getting within 20 or 30 miles.
Mind you, we've got a great big fleet to look after us anyway, haven't we?
However, the fleet was taking very rough treatment from the Argentinian Air Force, who were bombing with great accuracy, even if the bombs were not all fused correctly. HMS Antelope, hit by an unexploded missile, eventually caught fire and exploded. The threat from beneath the sea occupied the minds of the men on the Iris as much as the dangers of air attack.
We must have been about 2 or 3 days out of Grytviken on the first time south, and the Navy Comms Office received a signal that an Argentine submarine was heading in the same direction on a converging course, and we were requested to take full anti-submarine measures. Well, this is all very well on a frigate, but it doesn't mean quite the same thing on a cable ship. Fortunately, the following morning, as we entered the ice fields, we heard that the intelligence report was incorrect, and this particular submarine was still off the Argentine coast with defective torpedo tubes. It made us all feel very much better.
On May the 25th, the Atlantic Conveyor was lost, the first non-naval vessel to be hit.
Yeah, I think when we was at South Georgia, we heard the Atlantic Conveyor had gone down. And I think everyone was really upset, and then in a matter of hours we were on our way there with a load of steel, hoping to take it to the Atlantic Conveyor to repair it. But as you know, it sunk. That was it.
At the old whaling station at Grytviken was the scrap metal, which had been one of the causes of the Falklands War when the Argentinians had attempted to salvage it. Now it was to be used to repair the battle-damaged Navy vessels.
In fact, it's being called scrap. It is, in fact, extremely good quality steel that was put there for the repair of the whaling fleet. It is still in extremely good condition and obviously was ideal for repairing the frigates that were damaged.
The worst moment of the whole trip for me, I would think, was actually being with the battle crew.
Navigating the ship totally blacked out, without navigation lights or any form of lights. The possibility of encountering other ships blacked out. The fact that we weren't allowed to use radar, or a very limited use of radar, were things that we'd never encountered before.
Amongst my fellow Merchant Navy officers on board, as I understood the forms and the abbreviations, the tasks that are required, and the basic speech in the Royal Navy, which can be totally alien to anyone else who's never heard it before.
The danger now increased, as Iris, by joining the battle fleet, had also entered the main target area.
My 23rd birthday, I was quietly sitting in my cabin thinking, well, but there's another year gone by, and all of a sudden we're getting air raid warning. So I think, well, am I going to see me 24th? I want a very happy birthday, I can tell you.
How are you celebrating?
All by myself.
While the Iris was amongst the fleet, one of the most tragic episodes of the war took place, Bluff Cove. On the eve of the British assault on the capital, Port Stanley, Argentinian planes hit two landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram. There were large numbers of dead and wounded. As our forces advanced steadily across the inhospitable landscape of the Falklands in winter, so the Iris moved steadily amongst the ships of the fleet, delivering mail, transferring stores, taking parties of men from one ship to another. While the newspapers were filled with the exploits of our army on Mount Tumbledown, the log on the Iris records that she was setting off once again on the long journey back to Ascension. Soon the war was over, but the job of the Iris was not yet finished. As British troops moved into the world's most southerly city, Iris was once more in the tropics.
Well, after the hostilities ceased and we'd finished taking stores down to the fleet, which was our main operation as a dispatch vessel, we were then tasked to take Falkland Island families who had come back after hostilities for home leave back down to the Falkland Islands again, from Ascension Island to Port Stanley. This was a little bit worrying insofar as they were all families and it consisted of small children. One family had a baby of 6 weeks old, and for a 3,000-mile passage through the roaring 40s, it was a bit worrying at times, I must admit. However, the passengers are marvellous. They are Falkland Island people, pioneers, and they fitted in with the ship's company and in fact really enjoyed their passage down. Although the weather was rough, they said they would like to sail on the British Telecom's cruise line again.
There was one serious casualty of the whole operation, the beer.
Right, the reason we had to ditch this beer force was when we were sailing south and our beer was down in our lower wing tanks, the condensation and the sweat of the tanks just damaged all the cases of beer, and then we brought the beer up to the mess rooms, and the doctor had a look at it, and the doctor says he tested all the beer and he said it was really completely no good for drinkage at all, so that is the reason we had to ditch it, really.
When the Iris reached Stanley once more, there was a chance for her crew to go ashore.
Well, like, originally they give us all camouflage gear to wear ashore, like, you know, because it was so cold down there. And we walked ashore, got off the barge, walked ashore, and we got stopped by these MPs. They said, you'll have to put your caps on, like, you know. I said, you know, what are you on about, sort of put caps on? And he says, well, you're not going ashore until you've got your caps on and stripes and all this gear. And he said, well, we're merchant seamen, you know. And it's, oh, Christ, why don't you dare tell us, like, you know.
It was a reception which marked the end of hostilities and the beginning of what the newspapers described as Britain's continuing military presence in the Falklands. A Another 5 months of demanding routine lay ahead of the Iris before she could sail back to her home port, and a reception a great deal warmer than that provided by the military police in Port Stanley.
We were proud of the way in which you picked up the challenge and you went off. We were proud of you of the way in which you performed down in the South Atlantic. And we were delighted to have you back with us safely here today with all your family. You've really done us and Britain proud, and we really are extremely delighted to see that you've got back, not only in beautiful weather, but bang on time as usual. Well done.
We regard it as being a highly successful event, and showed to us how much we rely upon the Merchant Navy, and I hope it has brought the Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy very much closer together. It has been, I think, an occasion in which we have demonstrated the value to this country of maritime power.
Ladies and gentlemen, being only a simple sailor, I'm afraid I've had to write my speech down. I can't remember the facts and figures, but on behalf of the ship's company and myself, I should like to thank our special guests for, first of all, their kind words of welcome, and secondly, for giving up their valuable time to welcome the Iris and its crew back to Southampton. We do not feel that we've done anything special, but I would be untruthful if I did not say that I was proud of the way in which the Iris carried out her task in the South Atlantic, and I'm proud to be a captain. Now, ships are only as good as the men that sail in them, and this is where I've been very fortunate. I won't embarrass anyone by singling them out for praise, because the list would be too long. But I'd like to say that if I had to go to war again, I certainly would want to go with the same crowd of men.
One of the funny things about Brit Telecom is that I suddenly discovered that I got jack of all trades and masters of every trade.
We did have a few minor hiccups, but nothing that prevented us from fulfilling the task for which we were sent down.
I think we all had mixed feelings about things, you know, but you just went and that was it, you know.
It's an experience that I'm very pleased that I have been through. I don't know whether I would like to actually repeat it again, but I would definitely not have missed it. It was a marvellous experience. And this tremendous comradeship between people, and especially between our own ship's company and the crew, and the naval party.
As far as the crew is concerned, there always has been this spirit on this ship. They always work together in any job we tackled.
I think everybody would go again, even though we went through what we did go through.
Of course, every one of us would do. It's been an enlightening experience. A few of us are more or less too old for conscription, that any effort that we had, we wanted to give, and we'd all give it again. Especially, as I say, under our own skipper. He looked after us, and we tried to do our best for him.
It would be difficult to say that you enjoyed, you know, something like that. But to say that, I would say that I would not have missed it. I would not have liked to have been left at home. As it was my ship that was chosen, there was no way I was going to be left at home. I found it very exciting, and if I was asked to do it again, I would do it.